We have 12,500 nuclear weapons, and it is down from a high of close to 70,000 nuclear weapons at the height of the Cold War. But the numbers don't tell the full story. The level of risk today is higher than it ever was, even at the height of the Cold War, and I'll come back to that point. But when the destructive potential of nuclear weapons was made evident very clearly on August 6th and August 9th in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki, it awakened the international community to this devastating potential. Never before had such force being unleashed. There is no more devastating instrument of mass destruction ever created than nuclear weapons. And it became very clear with the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And since then, and this is more than 78 years ago now, and since then, various efforts have been made by the international community to move towards a world free of nuclear weapons. But these have been not only unsuccessful, but indeed, from many perspectives, we are walking backwards, where the risk is higher, the prospects for abolition are lower, and the rationale for the retention of nuclear weapons continues to be a central feature of the policies of the states that possess them. So that is really a very problematic picture about the prospects for nuclear disarmament. The very first United Nations Security Council resolution concerned the elimination of nuclear weapons. So it is important to clarify that when one speaks of nuclear abolition, for instance, of the obligation of Canada to support a nuclear abolition effort, or the obligation of the international community, for that matter, to pursue the abolition of nuclear weapons, this is not a peacenik thing to say. This is already established. It is the official position of Canada and of all countries, for that matter, that are party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to pursue a goal with nuclear weapons. So that part alone should not be scandalous or surprising or in any way revolutionary. That is the goal. It is the accepted goal of the international community. The question is, are the strategies and the policies and the efforts made to get to nuclear abolition effective? And the answer at this point is a resounding no. They have not been effective. So in 1968, there was the international community negotiated what is often referred to as the cornerstone of the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime in the form of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, which came into force in 1970. And there are three basic pillars. And for all the, the intricacies and technicalities and jargon around nuclear weapons, the structure of the NPT was or seemed to be rather straightforward. We speak of three pillars. One that most agree with is that there can be cooperation, international cooperation on the peaceful uses of nuclear energy to which every country, state party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is entitled. The two other pillars have an interesting interaction. One is the disarmament pillar, and the other is the non-proliferation pillar. So basically, the very few states that had nuclear weapons when the NPT came into effect in 1970, and these are 5 states, which happen to be the same 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. So that is the United States, the Russian Federation, China, the United Kingdom, and France, would disarm. And the vast majority of the international community who did not have nuclear weapons would make a commitment never to acquire them. So on the surface, it seemed like a good bargain. That was the grand bargain of the NPT. Everybody gets to enjoy the peaceful uses of nuclear energy including for very beneficial applications, cancer research, all sorts of applications. The few who have them would give them up, and the many who don't have them would stay as non-nuclear weapon states. So that was the promise of the NPT. But you fast forward to today, and even though by and large, the non-proliferation side of the NPT has held quite well, there have been a few tension points, including, for instance, related to Iran and the efforts to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. The non-proliferation side has held very well, remarkably well, I would say. But you look at the commitment of the 5 nuclear weapon states that they made to disarm under what we call, or under what is Article 6 of the NPT. And not only have they not disarmed, but now the situation is worse. The weapons that they have are getting millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars every year collectively in modernization programs. These are modernization programs that are going to prolong the life of these weapons. They are seen as an investment, and they're going to not just prolong the life, but make these weapons all that more destructive and powerful and devastating. In fact, some modern weapons are tens of times, if not hundreds of times, more powerful than the ones that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So just to give you an idea of just how misleading just the question or the metric of numbers can be. There are fewer nuclear weapons, but much more destructive, modernized, and more effective. In addition to spending in the modernization of nuclear weapons, there used to be 5 states with nuclear weapons. Now there are 9. So now we have 4 states that are not part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that are nonetheless nuclear armed states. And these are India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. Everybody acknowledges India's nuclear weapons and Pakistan's nuclear weapons, and North Korea, which actually used to be a state party to the NPT and withdrew to pursue its nuclear weapons program. And in theory, there are questions about Israel's nuclear weapons program because Israel has had a policy of opacity or deliberate ambiguity about the possession of their weapons. They say they neither confirm nor deny. But we know they have nuclear weapons. Everybody knows that they have nuclear weapons. So it's really 9 nuclear armed states that we're dealing with modernized weapons and with doctrines and policies and laws that are more conducive to the retention of these arsenals than to their elimination. So the NPT promise, to put it quite starkly and quite simply, is not delivering. There was a very clear promise of abolition, moving the world towards the abolition of nuclear weapons, which has not been fulfilled. But once again, we're not even on neutral territory. It's not that the promise has not been fulfilled, it's that we feel that we're walking backwards and taking steps back from abolition, and that the situation is actually becoming more complicated, and that the idea of a world without nuclear weapons, important as it is, urgent as it is, continues to be quite elusive if you look at the science. So this status quo, this situation, this state of affairs, was allowed to go on for many years, and there were efforts. There were nuclear security summits. There have been at the NPT review process itself, which holds meetings almost every year, with a big meeting every 5 years called the Review Conference. But despite all of this, again, the prospects for nuclear abolition seem increasingly dim. So a transformation happened in the past few years. The international community, the non-nuclear weapon states, or many of the non-nuclear weapon states, started to become impatient and vocal and militant and finding strength in numbers and rallying around the cause of abolition and rallying around their impatience for the blatant lack of progress on the disarmament obligation of nuclear weapon states. International community was like, what gives? We're complying with our non-proliferation obligations, and not only are you not disarming, but you're making things worse. You're blocking every effort to really move forward towards nuclear abolition. Every state, including the United States, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, France, and the 4 outside of the regime, speaks of supporting the eventual goal of nuclear abolition, always couched in this term, eventual. But whenever they are faced with proposals for having specific benchmarks, targets, timelines, specific goals, they reject them. They want no specificity. So for decades, they have kept this commitment to nuclear abolition as this vague objective, this vague ethereal goal. But the policies that would lead us to this objective are just not there, quite the contrary. So let's go back to the impatience of the international community. The international community started being rightly obfuscated, rightly just short on their patience for the lack of progress, and the sense of impotence that the P5, because they're powerful, not just in nuclear weapons, but commercially, in conventional military capabilities, by their very membership in the United Nations Security Council, were blocking every attempt at progress. Every turn, there was an attempt at progress, and there was this increasingly evident gap between the rhetoric and the reality. Because the rhetoric of these states, including the United States, is not that bad. They speak of, or they used to, of their commitment to pursuing a world without nuclear weapons. But the reality tells a completely different story. And in this context of impatience, there was a dimension that started to gain increasing prominence, at least in the last decade, if not longer, and that has been accentuated in recent years, and that was this idea of highlighting the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. It sounds obvious. Nuclear weapons kill people, and there are humanitarian consequences. So what's new? The newness was the deliberate attention to this, and the incorporation of this idea of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons into advocacy efforts, into the demand for nuclear abolition. And then the debate started to change. Whereas it used to be a debate that was full of jargon, references to articles, and this notion of state security as the primary factor to consider, and for many, the only factor to consider, state security and national security, the rhetoric and the narrative around it started to change. People were like, state security, national security? What about the people who are going to die? I mean, it's the people that are going to die. And this is, by definition, an indiscriminate weapon. By that, I mean that it cannot distinguish borders, that its effects are long-lasting in time. So the indiscriminate nature, coupled with the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, started to shake things up a little bit in the halls of the United Nations, in capitals, in the civil society movement, in progressive governments that really, to put it quite simply, had had enough. They were saying, like, we can't be subject to this. We can't be hostage to 5 or 9 states, as the case may be, to these weapons that would have implications globally for all of humanity, that could end life as we know it. So then this idea that something could be done about it, that the P5 were powerful, but not that powerful, that they could control the narrative by others, that they could prevent others from at least taking some initiative and trying to address the nuclear question. So in this context, civil society started to grow in numbers, in effectiveness, in funding, in sophistication, having a presence at key forums. ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, of which I'm a proud member, Project Ploughshares is a proud partner, started being increasingly active, partnering with states, advancing this notion of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. All of a sudden, at United Nations conferences, you would see hibakushas, which is the name for the survivors of Hiroshima. You would see them there, and they would create a visceral reaction, even among diplomats. Because it was a very real and immediate reminder of the impact of nuclear weapons. The rights of victims, not just victims from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which are fortunately the only two, or fortunately there have not been more, but also from testing, from nuclear weapons testing, downwinders, as they call them, in Nevada, in Semipalatinsk, in Kazakhstan, in the Marshall Islands, intergenerational effects, medical hereditary conditions, grandkids still showing the impacts of radiation and the effects of radiation, plus the survivors themselves. And this started to change the discourse somewhat. And all of a sudden, in these cold halls of the United Nations that are quite solemn and accustomed to very technical sort of discussions of treaty elements, etc., you will start hearing references to bone marrows and cancer and burnt children and burnt hair and things of the sort. It was a constant reminder to diplomats from both progressive states and those wishing to retain nuclear weapons that the human element cannot and will not be ignored. that the impact of these weapons will ultimately be on people, and that it is not speculative. Here they are. We can show you. These are the survivors. These are the downwinders. These are the victims of nuclear weapons testing. And it started to change the narrative a little bit. Still, states with nuclear weapons were digging in their heels. Abolition is not going to happen. This is naive. They kept alluding to this argument, which still they make today, that somehow international security conditions need to be ideal for nuclear disarmament. That there needs to be a certain ripeness of conditions for nuclear disarmament to proceed. And of course, our response has long been, there will never be ideal international security conditions. And the implication there is that nuclear disarmament and abolition efforts must proceed under international security conditions that are going to be predictably less than perfect. Otherwise, it will never happen. Never. It's hard to conceive of a major conflict today in which at least one of the P5 countries, if members of the Security Council, don't have an interest or an influence in one way or another. So this notion that conditions aren't quite right for nuclear disarmament was seen with increasing skepticism. And we were like, this is sounding like a delay tactic. You keep saying that. Imagine if the rest of the international community that is committed to non-proliferation referred to the lack of ideal international security conditions to justify their lack of compliance. No, they don't proliferate. And by the same token, these states, in theory, should have been moving faster and towards the clear and unequivocal goal of nuclear disarmament. In this context, between 2013 and 2014, so not that long ago, there was a series of conferences that started to really bring home this debate about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. So there were 3 conferences specifically on the issue of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, which were unprecedented and revolutionary, and very importantly, against the specific wishes of the states with nuclear weapons. They did not want this debate. They didn't want this debate to happen. They didn't want this debate to advance on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. And already it was becoming clear that this debate was not just happening just because, but there was an intention that it was leading to this idea of having an explicit prohibition on nuclear weapons. More about that in a minute. So first, the government of Norway announced a conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, and ICANN announced a parallel conferences in Oslo. And with skepticism, the states with nuclear weapons thought that it was going to go nowhere, that it was going to be a one-off. And on the day that it ended, and I had the opportunity to be in Oslo, then on the day that it ended, the government of Mexico announced that that would not end there, that they would also be hosting a conference specifically on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. So Mexico offered to host, and sure enough, they did. Soon after, the next year in 2014, I also had the opportunity to be there. And this is like a United Nations conference, except it's not in New York, but in Nayarit, Mexico. And again, the enthusiasm continued to grow. And this idea that this process could and should lead to an explicit prohibition of nuclear weapons, on the premise that there was sufficient ambiguity in the NPT disarmament obligation that it needed to be reinforced. And on the premise that there was a certain anomaly under international law, whereby every other category of weapons of mass destruction had been specifically outlawed, but nuclear weapons, the most destructive of them all, had not. So we have a chemical weapons convention, we have a biological weapons convention, but we didn't have and we still don't have a nuclear weapons convention, but now we have something called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is a result of these conferences. More about the TPNW in a minute. At the end of the Mexico conference in the city, beautiful, called Nayarit, again, and we heard during the conference of efforts behind the scenes of states with nuclear weapons to jeopardize the process, to stop it right there on its tracks, to make sure that it didn't go anywhere else. And on the last day, the Mexican foreign minister, said quite famously that was a point of no return, that we were going for an explicit prohibition of nuclear weapons. And soon, and sure enough, the government of Austria said they were going to step up and hold yet a third conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. So there was no doubt at this point that there was a group in the international community that wanted to pursue this. I want to pursue this line, this dimension of nuclear weapons as an advocacy strategy, as a path to abolition, and as a way to get negotiations on an explicit prohibition of nuclear weapons. At the last day of the Vienna conference, which I also had the opportunity to attend, the Austrians released what was eventually known as the Humanitarian Pledge, which, basically laying very strongly, making a very strong case for the abolition of nuclear weapons, and stating with no equivocation that nuclear weapons should not be used under any circumstances. And these are three words that have proven to be quite offensive for states that are not on board with the abolition of nuclear weapons. They keep trying to carve out exceptions of circumstances under which the use of nuclear weapons may be warranted or justified. But the message from the other side, from those pushing for abolition, was they cannot be used under any circumstances. And the policy implication of this whole process was that there needed to be negotiations on an explicit instrument to prohibit these weapons. So then this eventually led to something called an open-ended working group in Geneva, which created the mandate for the negotiations of what was to be the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So this was negotiated in New York, and on July 7th, 2017, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, against all odds, against the opposition of the states that actually have nuclear weapons, was adopted at the United Nations. And I was there in the hall when it was adopted, and it was bizarre in a positive way, because it didn't feel like the UN. There were tears, there was applause, there were goosebumps. It was like you could feel that there was something big happening. There was something that the international community was really, in a way, rebelling and saying, we've had enough. We're going to pursue this, and you cannot tell us how we can make a contribution to this, to what you say is your goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. About 3 months later, the Norwegian Nobel Committee, almost exactly 3 months to the day, the Norwegian Nobel Committee in October of 2017 announced that they would be awarding ICANN the Nobel Peace Prize for that year. And they cited two reasons when giving this award. One, of course, was for the role that ICANN had in creating the conditions for this treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and for partnering with states so effectively to create it. And secondly, and just as important, for highlighting the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and bringing the victims' experiences to light. And those were the two reasons for which ICANN was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and I think it was a recognition, of course, of not just of ICANN's work, but the work of so many people over so many years, including in states, in governments, for the abolition of nuclear weapons. And this has been a sore point ever since. The states with nuclear weapons recognize the legitimacy of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. They did not even want to participate in the negotiations, despite the repeated urging of those who were behind the initiative. They simply boycotted, which is, by the way, a diplomatic faux pas. I mean, these are friends of these states who are saying, come to the table. There's no predetermined outcome. You reserve the right to not agree at the end of whatever outcome. Just come to the table. Let's have a conversation about how we can move forward the path to nuclear abolition. And they didn't go. They boycotted. And there was a memo from NATO that was leaked eventually at one point that specifically asked the United States, asking its NATO allies, including Canada, to boycott the whole endeavor. And sure enough, Canada did, and that continues to be our position. More on that later. So now we had two competing regimes, in a way, the NPT and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Although I shouldn't say competing, because the the TPNW responds to the NPT's aspirations to create to advance on nuclear disarmament, and there have been several other efforts outside of the NPT that have contributed to this effort. So we had these two regimes, and it continues to be a very divisive issue. And the division does not only isolate the states with nuclear weapons, but there is a third group. There's the few that have nuclear weapons, the many that don't have them. But there is a third group, of which Canada is a member, that is very consequential as well. And these are states without nuclear weapons, but whose policies and doctrines are nonetheless more closely aligned with their nuclear armed allies. And this is the classic example is NATO, the members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, most of which are non-nuclear weapon states, but they endorse nuclear deterrence as a legitimate security doctrine. In NATO's most important document, which is called the Strategic Concept, they frame nuclear weapons as their supreme security guarantee. They say, with no ambiguity, and not at all in an apologetic tone, they say that as long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. So this is really a recipe for the perpetuation of nuclear weapons. And countries like Canada walk a very odd duality. On the one hand, they present themselves, including at NPT meetings, as a responsible actor that does not have nuclear weapons, as a responsible non-nuclear weapon state. But at the same time, we are party to and endorse the nuclear weapons doctrine of NATO. We participate in NATO's nuclear weapons planning group, and our positions, including recent positions and our reaction to the TPNW, have left a lot to be desired in terms of Canada's commitment to the pursuit of nuclear weapons. So that's the general state of affairs of sort of the regimes. There's the NPT, which proved ineffective, and there's a more recent TPNW, or Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has given hope and momentum to the nuclear weapons cause, but that everybody, including its strongest supporters, and I count myself among the strongest supporters, and I participated in the negotiations with ICANN, and we all recognize it's not enough. You know, it's not overnight. It's not going to bring about abolition tomorrow or next week or next month, but it's something. It is a response to the lack of action by the nuclear weapon states, and for lack of a better word, the desperation of the rest of the international community, and their desire to have some agency and to have some cards in the matter, and really have to have some sort of pressure mechanism. Now, the intention was never to leave out the states with nuclear weapons from the treaty, not at all. The intention was, and continues to be, for the TPNW to be a universal treaty that leads to the actual elimination of nuclear weapons. And it has provisions for non-nuclear weapon states, has provisions for states that are non-nuclear, but are party to nuclear alliances like Canada and other NATO members. And it has provisions for states who actually have nuclear weapons. And in all cases, the premise is whoever joins the treaty, you know, understands the goal of the treaty of eliminating nuclear weapons. So there are efforts to bring NATO members in. There are efforts to bring of course, the states with nuclear weapons in, but these are efforts that continue to be rejected by states that have the nuclear weapons. That's sort of the general sort of policy side of things, the existing regimes. But now I'm going to share with you some realities that perhaps go beyond, you know, an explanation of the NPT or an explanation of the TPNW, to really understand how dire the situation can be, and to really understand the sort of the state of affairs. So I'm going to speak of sort of 5 basic fundamentals, let's call them. The first, as I hinted at, or as I mentioned at the beginning, but just to reiterate, the risk has never been higher. Again, Not to sound alarmist, but if you ask any nuclear disarmament expert, I think they will agree that the risk has never been higher. I often refer to, I didn't witness it myself, but videos I've seen of duck and cover exercises, you know, in black and white, or during the Cold War, kids sort of going under their desks practicing for a potential nuclear attack. You know, that time, the risk is higher today. The risk is higher today than it has ever been. There is an organization called the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in the United States. Very credible. In its board of directors, there is, I think, more than a dozen Nobel laureates, just very, very authoritative. And they have this thing called the doomsday clock, which is a metaphorical image, you know, of how close we are to Armageddon. And the second hand of the doomsday clock, you know, keeps getting closer and closer to midnight representing Armageddon, you know, the end of times, or at least civilization-altering catastrophe. And this year, in January, usually said it, you know, they consider where the place is the second hand. They placed it at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest to midnight it has ever been, including at the height of the Cold War. It had never been at 90 seconds to midnight. Before that, the year before, it was at 120 seconds to midnight, and the year before, also 120 seconds to midnight, only matched in 1953 in terms of the risk, the relative risk. Now, this isn't a guarantee of anything. This is the assessment of some people, but still it tells you something. In the past 3 years, 2 of them have been as high as it was during the Cold War. And this year, the highest the risk has ever been. So really, that should tell us something. And perhaps it's no coincidence that this happened in as the war in Ukraine was already ongoing, and as you know, Russia had made veiled and more direct threats of resorting to its nuclear arsenal. So that was certainly taken into consideration. But don't be fooled into thinking that the risk started with the Ukraine war. We could be having a very similar conversation, and I'd be giving very similar remarks before February 2022 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this notion that the Russian invasion of Ukraine created the risk of nuclear weapons use has to be unpacked and, you know, and properly understood. I don't want to minimize the risk there, and I do believe there's a real risk of escalation that could potentially lead to consideration of nuclear weapons, if not their use. But I want to be clear that this situation in Ukraine simply adds a layer of complexity to what was already an unacceptably high risk before the invasion even started. The dynamics were very similar. The resistance to disarmament was already similar. And looking into the future, we don't know what will happen. I fear that the international community is going to end up drawing all the wrong conclusions from the Ukraine crisis. If there is no nuclear weapons detonation, and we all hope there isn't, and I'm not saying it's the most likely scenario either, but it could happen. Let's say the war in Ukraine ends, hopefully sooner rather than later. I fear rather than recognizing the close call and moving earnestly towards nuclear abolition, the international community will sit back, regroup, and say, you know how we prevent this from happening again? By arming ourselves even more, by modernizing our weapons even more. That's how you stop. How do you prevent another Putin? With more nuclear weapons than him. You know, and this sort of mentality that is very clearly reminiscent of arms racing during the Cold War. And that is the reality. Some people say a new Cold War 2.0, or whatever term one might use. The reality is that we are in the midst of a very real deterioration of the strategic relationship between the United States and the Russian Federation. I'll say a few words about China in a minute. But the situation is dire from a risk perspective. And I think that every effort should be made to minimize that risk, including in the context of the Ukraine war. Of course, in the back of our minds is also the fact that Israel and Gaza, Israel and Hamas are fighting in Gaza and in that region, course, Israel has a nuclear arsenal, and one hopes that the situation doesn't evolve in such a way that anyone considers that could be any solution to the conflict. In any case, the risk is as high as it has ever been. Second point, there is, unfortunately, no plan for nuclear disarmament. None. There is no nuclear disarmament enterprise. There is no process. There is no project. There is no impetus that would make any reasonable observer say, okay, at least we're on track to nuclear abolition. There may be some corrective actions necessary here and there. Maybe we're going to have to reassess a couple of specific elements, but at least, there is a goal and a plan and an agreement among, major leaders, certainly Moscow and Washington and Beijing, and that makes at least one think that there is a path to nuclear abolition. There is none. There is no path. There's no agreement. There are no targets. There are no benchmarks. There are no goals. There's the NPT regime, which is highly ineffective. And there's the TPNW, which doesn't have the nuclear armed states as part of it. Beyond that, there are proposals, there are good intentions, there are empty promises, there are vague ideas, but there's no holistic plan that brings together the nuclear weapon states in a path towards abolition. There is none, like not even close. There is none. There is a haphazard combination of crisis and meetings and conferences and proposals and marches sometimes and civil society activism, etc. But there is no plan. There is no process. We're not underway to nuclear abolition. No such thing. Unfortunately, it needs to be fixed. Another dimension, sort of a basic dimension. Every state has legitimate security interests. Every state has legitimate security interests. Does this include North Korea too? Yeah, of course it includes North Korea. Does it include the Russian Federation? Yes, it includes the Russian Federation and the United States and Canada and Mexico. They all have legitimate security interests. From the perspective of the states that were pushing for the TPNW, their legitimate security interest is born out of a sense of self-preservation and knowing that the indiscriminate nature of nuclear weapons would make them and their citizens vulnerable too. From the perspective of, say, the Russian Federation, the equation is different. This is a strategic competition with the United States, with NATO, that since the end of the Cold War has expanded eastward and has set up military bases in more than a dozen countries, including some former Soviet republics. So one can criticize Putin, and rightly so, illegal and the invasion of Ukraine and the aggression and the humanitarian suffering that he's causing, or that the Russian military is causing. And one can't deny that Russia, like every other country, has legitimate security interests and legitimate security aspirations. They want to be safe. They don't want to feel attacked. And closer to our part of the world, of course, we have legitimate security interests. We want to be safe. We want to preserve a certain relationship with the United States, who's our closest ally and who itself has legitimate security interests. But we can't pursue anybody's security interests to the expense of another country, because as soon as you start doing that, that's going to lead to tensions. So every country has a legitimate security interest. Another fundamental part of this puzzle is that we are in the midst of a global transformation from a unipolar order to a multipolar order. And that in itself has created, would have predictably created, and will continue to create some tensions. We were for many decades living in a world where the United States was and continues to be, by some definitions, by this is changing, the one and only and undisputed hegemon, a unipolar global order, not just militarily, financially, culturally, in terms of commerce, in terms of weapons, it was the player. But that is changing. Some states are reclaiming or are claiming a place as superpowers. And once Russia passes, or this crisis with Russia and Ukraine passes, there's China that is growing economically, militarily, financially, politically, in influencing Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. And that is a reality that we have to contend with in the West. The world is changing. And denial is not a strategy. And for as much as we may want to reject the notion that China is coming and is going to challenge the United States unipolarity, it doesn't take our agreement for that to happen. That will happen, or at least every sign points to the fact that that will happen. And China is just an example. There are others claiming their role in this reconfigured global order. And the reason why this is important is because any prescriptions to the nuclear disarmament program must take into account this multipolarity. The solutions cannot be dictated by one country or one sector or one bloc alone. All of the interests of all of these players need to be taken into account, lest any solutions be doomed to failure. So we need to recognize this multipolarity and act accordingly. Another basic fundamental in this equation is one that tends to be controversial, a little bit at least. It is the notion that nuclear deterrence works. Not always, not perfectly, not predictably, but sometimes under some circumstances, at least, nuclear deterrence works, at least for the purposes that it is intended by some countries. It's a controversial statement because since nuclear deterrence is the basis, the logical and the doctrinal basis for the retention of nuclear weapons, abolitionists hate it. Even the word abolitionists hate the notion of nuclear deterrence. And sometimes you hear things like, I don't believe in nuclear deterrence, as if it was a matter of it either exists or it doesn't. Of course it exists. It's a reality. You deter someone from acting a certain way out of fear of the fact that you have nuclear weapons. Ask Kim Jong-un if nuclear deterrence works. As the Russian Federation in the context of the current conflict, if they think nuclear deterrence works. Why hasn't NATO gone in? Ask NATO if they think nuclear deterrence works. Why is Russia careful not to bomb Poland? Because there is an impact of nuclear weapons that is undeniable. So the question is not, does nuclear deterrence exist or not? It does. The question is, does it make sense as a security strategy? And the answer is no. It is a foolish and highly dangerous security doctrine. It is highly dangerous. And the policy implication of this realization is that it has to be replaced by some sort of other security architecture. Some of my colleagues refer to it as alternative security arrangements, common security. But there cannot be a vacuum. There was an op-ed already years ago by Henry Kissinger and William Perry, some and some older statesmen of the United States, and in the Wall Street Journal, and a widely quoted, and I don't agree with these gentlemen on many other things, but they had a line that is widely quoted, and I think is quite real. They said, "A world without nuclear weapons will not simply be today's world minus nuclear weapons. Other things have to change." And we would argue, rather than having your security strategy hinge on the annihilation of humanity, on the destructive potential of these weapons, on the destabilizing effect that they hold, the answer has to lie in the rule of law, multilateral institutions, and the peaceful resolution of armed conflict. There is no other way. But there has to be some sort of architecture. There has to be some sort of architecture to account for the perceived vulnerabilities of the states that are at play. So these are some realities that make the prospect for nuclear abolition quite complicated. Now, where does Canada stand in all of this? Canada, as I said, is a member of NATO, and its doctrines and its policies are more closely aligned with its NATO, with those of its NATO allies than with the rest of the international community that is clamoring ever loudly for nuclear abolition. We have engaged, a lot of colleagues here in Canada that I greatly respect, repeatedly with the Canadian government. And one thing is that no one, as far as I know, no one outside of government, including experts, academics, former diplomats that follow this file, are persuaded that Canada is doing all it can. In fact, many of us think that Canada is being counterproductive in the quest of nuclear abolition. In many ways, and I've told this to some of my government counterparts, I've said Canada is seen, at least in the United Nations conferences that I attend sometimes, Canada is seen as an obstacle to overcome on the path to nuclear abolition, not as an ally, not as a country that is pushing hard and consistently for nuclear abolition, but as an obstacle to overcome. As a country, and this is not speculative, as a country whose stated view on nuclear weapons, as reflected in the NATO policy that Canada openly endorses, is that they are the supreme security guarantee for Canada. So at the end of the day, there are two camps in the international community. There are those who see it as a supreme security guarantee, and there are those who see it as the gravest threat to international security. And at the end of the day, these are mutually exclusive propositions. You can't have it both ways. They are either the gravest threat or the supreme guarantee of security. And the latter will not lead to abolition. Only if you consider them to be the gravest threat will you work earnestly towards abolition. Because if you consider them to be your supreme security guarantee, what incentive do you even have to give them up? You don't. They're the supreme security guarantee. So there needs to be a paradigm shift in the understanding of nuclear weapons. A paradigm shift such that even leaders in Moscow, in Beijing, in Tel Aviv, in Delhi, in Washington, in Paris, in London, recognize that even for them, it's not in their best interest to continue this perpetuation of nuclear weapons. Forget about the impact on the rest of the world and the risk for humanity, even for countries that have no nuclear weapons. It is not in the best interest of the United States, of the very weapons possessors, to continue this security doctrine that will sooner or later end in nuclear catastrophe unless and until nuclear weapons are completely eliminated. So that is a paradigm shift that needs to happen. Now, it just so happens that the states that have nuclear weapons and that are resisting abolition consider themselves at the same time arbiters and direct beneficiaries of the norms around the acceptability of nuclear weapons. So they'll say, we can have them, but you cannot. Why can you have them? Because it is to protect our vital security interests. Okay, can I have them to protect my vital security interests? No, that would be a grave threat to international security if you get them. But they're acceptable for us and only us. And this system that is riddled with such double standards has become offensive to many in the international community. Like, what gives? Like, what gives you the right not only to hold us hostage with these weapons, but to say that you're the only ones who can have them? Now, I'm not arguing that for the fact that everyone should have them. I'm arguing for the fact that no one should. But such is the audacity with which they, with complete normality, they perpetuate these double standards. But the international community is denouncing them ever more vigorously and challenging the very logic and underpinning their assumption that they get to have them, but nobody else. They have said, in the context of the TPNW, that a key flaw of the TPNW is that it is not consensual. There is no consensus around it. Well, of course there isn't. Of course. By design, there isn't. We have two categories of states. We're trying to get the states that have been reluctant to give up nuclear weapons to give them up. And then there will be a consensus about that objective of the effective elimination of nuclear weapons. So until that happens, of course, there's a divide, there's a schism between the states that are supportive and those who are not. So what can we do? What have we been asking the government of Canada, for example? One very concrete request, and we worked very hard last year to make this happen unsuccessfully, was to get Canada to go to the first meeting, the historic, I might add, first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which took place last year in June in Vienna, and we were unsuccessful. And we were telling Canada, if you're not ready to join, why don't you go as an observer? You know, observing doesn't mean a commitment or endorsement or anything, you know. These are your friends that are inviting you to be there, Austria, you know, Mexico, Costa Rica. They may not be military allies in the same sense that NATO members are, but these are your friends. These are friendly countries. This is a legitimate, by the book diplomatic process. Why don't you go as an observer? And there was that possibility. There was that category of attending as an observer, just as a show of good faith. So you believe, even if you have concerns about the details of the treaty, that's why you haven't joined, but be at the table. As a show of good faith, sharing the objective that you so publicly espouse. But Canada resisted. Initially, we were told that even being there in Vienna was incompatible with NATO commitments. But soon after, we started hearing that Norway had decided to attend as an observer. And then we learned that Germany had decided to attend as an observer. And the Netherlands decided to attend as an observer. And Australia, even though it's not a member of NATO, but it's under the United States nuclear umbrella, decided to attend as an observer. So the Canadian argument that being there was incompatible with NATO commitments fell to the ground. We're like, Norway is in NATO, and they're going to be there. They found the political space to be there as an observer, mind you. As an observer, but still we saw value in that. They found the political, how can you not? You, the parents of the Ottawa Treaty, with a rich tradition of humanitarian disarmament. One of the early victories in humanitarian disarmament was the Ottawa Treaty. How can you tell us that you can't bear to be there even as an observer when Norway can be there, when Netherlands can be there? Netherlands and Germany, by the way, are not only NATO members, they host US nuclear weapons on their territory. So the United States has nuclear weapons in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Turkey, in Italy, and in Belgium, in Europe. Despite the fact that the NPT has very specific provisions against the transfer of nuclear weapons. You know what they say? That a transfer has not happened because the US retains control of the weapons. Let's see what would happen. The Russian Federation all of a sudden placed nuclear weapons in Venezuela and Guatemala and Colombia and said a transfer hasn't happened because we retain control. No, it wouldn't happen. It wouldn't get there. There would be war before that. It would be deemed unacceptable. Just over 60 years ago, the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, but the United States does it with such normality, and NATO, the stationing of weapons, that they fail apparently to see the destabilizing effect of these policies. Certainly, I don't want to sound apologetic for the other side, for Russia, which has done its share of irresponsible things, most recently invoking nuclear weapons inacceptably in the context of the Ukraine conflict. But that just goes to show you that one of the adages in one of the sayings in these debates is that there are no right hands for wrong weapons. And one of my fears in this context of the Ukraine conflict and all the denunciations of Russia's references to nuclear weapons, which I think are well warranted, and any threats to use nuclear weapons must be denounced and rejected. But all this anti-Russia sentiment that they earned, they give the impression that there are bad nuclear weapons and by implication, good nuclear weapons on this side. So let me say that again. There are no right hands for wrong weapons. It doesn't matter. And if there is a risk and nuclear weapons end up being being utilized or detonated, it matters very little what you thought of the state possessor before they were detonated. The devastation will be just the same. So that is why the call cannot be compartmentalized to some countries that are perceived to be good actors or bad actors or better actors than others. The equation has to be elimination, complete elimination, and concrete progress towards that goal. But we are not seeing that. There is another meeting this year, the second meeting of states parties to the TPNW. And again, we're asking Canada. Now we're looking back at last year's and we're telling them, see, Norway was able to go and Germany was able to go. And there may be others that go this year, from NATO. Are you still not going to go? I'm just back from Ottawa. I was in Ottawa for the last week, including this morning in meetings with parliamentarians and other things related to nuclear disarmament. And we remain hopeful that this may change. At this point, the latest information we have is that Canada will again skip the second meeting of states parties to the TPNW, despite the insistence from civil society, from friendly states to be there as an observer, no prior commitments, no endorsement, just be there as an observer. And again, it seems that Canada is going to skip it. When we talk to the government, they say that nuclear disarmament is a priority for Foreign Affairs Canada, for Global Affairs Canada, as it's called these days. And it's a priority. And we tell them, you keep using that word priority. It doesn't seem like a priority, What might seem like a priority? A feminist international foreign policy, and people may have their views on how it's being implemented, but it seems like a priority. You hear it mentioned all the time at high levels, at the ministerial level, by the prime minister. There's funding behind it. That's a priority. That's a governmental priority. Nuclear disarmament, they claim it's a priority. I beg to disagree. It's understaffed, under-resourced, and the policy direction is just not there. That would make anyone think that it's a priority for Canada. At the heart of it, I believe, is this NATO thing. This commitment to nuclear weapons as part of that alliance that doesn't allow Canada to move forward. And this fear of blowback, I believe, from their nuclear armed allies, such as the United States. Remember when we were in the context of these humanitarian conferences on the impact of nuclear weapons, Mexico was one of its most vocal proponents. Mexico, even not a NATO member and other differences apply, but Mexico, no one can deny the deep interconnectedness that Mexico has with the United States on commercial matters, on trade issues, on gun controls, all sorts of things. And one might think, oh, Mexico would be vulnerable to leverage from the US to block it from participating, from sticking its neck out, from championing this initiative. And Mexico was able to compartmentalize the issue of nuclear weapons. And they said, yeah, we can talk commerce, gun control, immigration, anything you want, but we're not stopping. Nuclear weapons are unacceptable and we are going to act accordingly. So then, they're also the neighbor of the United States. They also have a bunch of interconnected interests, and they managed to push this forward. Of course, the NATO dimension is a layer that is not present in the Mexico relationship, but I just give it as an example of when there is determination, a lot of considerations can be put aside and just isolating the issue of nuclear weapons. In the case of Ukraine, I think Canada can also, and in the case, can also contribute. And I think a key way of contributing to decreasing the nuclear weapons risk has to do with avoiding, even inadvertently, creating the conditions under which nuclear weapons might be used. And that is the unfortunate reality. This is what deterrence looks like. And when I say, and I've had, tough crowds when I say we can't corner Russia into a position where it might be tempted to use nuclear weapons. And they say, you're giving in to Russia's nuclear blackmail. I'm like, okay, interesting perspective. What would it look like not to give in, according to that logic? Like to pretend as if there are no nuclear weapons in the question, but we know there are. And we know there are circumstances under which they will be used. And the reason we know that is because on the NATO side, there are also circumstances under which nuclear weapons might be used. And it doesn't matter which state it is, the formulation varies a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's a variation of if the vital security interests of the state are at stake, that's the narrow circumstance when nuclear weapons might be used. So I wonder, for those who say that we're going all the way in Ukraine, are calling for a decisive military victory. Some call for jail time for Putin. I'm not commenting on whether he deserves it or not. And I'm very mindful of the illegality of the actions that he started. But just from a nuclear risk perspective, those who say we should go for a decisive military victory in Ukraine, I wonder whether a decisive military victory starts to look a little bit too much like the narrow set of circumstances under which a country might consider resorting to nuclear weapons. That's all I'm saying. And we should avoid those circumstances. Because if there's no such thing as first and only use of nuclear weapons. There's the first shot, and then there's retaliation. And that's why in the Cold War, we were all familiar with the concept of mutually assured destruction. Because nuclear weapons are so bad that they redefine the very notions of victory and loss in military conflict. There are no winners, only losers. I will stop there. I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.